3-2.
The United States is still, I think, a ways from being willing to admit that it needs UN help. And even if it did, it's not entirely clear that countries like France and Germany, which may have extra peacekeeping capacity, really want to send them into Iraq, into such a dangerous situation.
What does UN control mean? Does UN control mean we stop fighting the terrorists in the Sunni Triangle? Does UN control mean that there is a possibility that Baathists would be restored to their positions in a new Iraqi government? Does UN control mean that we would say all foreign forces out by a date certain, which Kofi Annan has proposed, whether or not the security situation is good at that point, whether or not the Baathist elements that still have weapons have been found and destroyed? I don't think we want to turn this into a UN operation in that sense. And I think if that is the price, that price is too high.
Tonight in Baghdad, there was celebratory gunfire. Even amongst Ba'ath Party loyalists, Uday and Qusay were much hated. Their killing will also help reduce the political heat in London and Washington. But everyone knows there's much work left to do in Iraq.
John Lydon, picking up precisely that point, I'm joined now by our political correspondent, Vicky Young from Westminster. Vicky, any political reaction so far from here?
Yes, there has been. I think in the same way as President Bush has been really battered by the bad headlines coming out of Iraq, Tony Blair has really been under the same kind of pressures, lots of questions about why we went to war in the first place. So this will be welcome. We've had reaction already tonight from the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw. Now, he's really saying that Saddam's two sons share responsibility with their father for the hurt that they've inflicted on the Iraqi people over the last couple of decades. And he says that he would have preferred, of course, that they would have given themselves up and been brought to justice and made to pay for their crimes. On the other hand, of course, he says that he's extremely glad that they're not around to inflict hurt on the Iraqi people any longer. We've also heard from the Ministry of Defence in a very brief statement just saying that this shows that they're still trying to root out his regime, and the coalition in that sense is getting rewards. So I think in the short term, definitely some respite for Mr. Blair after a very difficult time. In the long term, of course, those questions about the whereabouts of weapons of mass destruction won't go away.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because the political stick with which he's been beaten is no Saddam Hussein, haven't got his sons, no WMD, and going back to Afghanistan, no Osama bin Laden. So it does, however, does it change the political mood a bit at Westminster?
I think it will a bit. Of course, as you know, it's the recess here. There's no MPs around. Before they went off for their summer holidays, certainly the pressure was building on Tony Blair in a terrible way. And all these questions coming from his own side as well about where those weapons are. Were we duped into going to war in the first place? I don't think any of that will go away. I think there will be a lot of relief that we are at last maybe getting closer to Saddam Hussein himself. And the fact that for once there is some good news, if you like, coming out of Iraq.
And more good news coming out of Washington, the discussions between the Attorney General and the Americans on what to do with the Guantanamo Bay detainees. Good news, at least for Tony Blair, you would think.
Yes, absolutely. You may remember again, just before MPs went off for their holidays, big pressure coming from the Labour backbenchers saying, you know, you say you've got this great relationship with George Bush. Well, can you do something about this? Very much, a lot of disquiet really about the fact that these men could face the death penalty if found guilty. So we've heard tonight from Lord Goldsmith, just in the last hour or so, he's been in talks over in Washington. He seems to have secured a number of things. He says that these men will not face the death penalty. He's got things like better access for the families to these two men. They will have a British lawyer who can be consulted on all of this. Of course, the whole point about bringing them home to be tried, I really think that was never going to be an option, because the Americans would not have given up these people without some kind of commitment from Britain that they would actually face trial. And of course, Tony Blair can't give that promise. It's up to the Crown Prosecution Service here to do that. So that probably was never an option. So in that sense, I think the government have done pretty well here to get these concessions.
OK, Vicky, thank you. Well, for a sense of what all this means for the future of Iraq, joining me are Dr. Robert Orr of the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington. He was recently part of a group sent to Iraq by the Pentagon to report on prospects for reconstruction. And here in London is the writer Adel Darwish, a specialist on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Adel Darwish, first of all, what do you think this means for ordinary Iraqis tonight?
I think it means a great deal. Last week I was in southern Iraq, and people there, despite what resembles law and order, despite things going well run by the British army in the southern Iraq, they are afraid. They fear that Saddam might come back one day and punish them. And they just, whatever you mention Saddam, they just look around themselves, and the tone of their voice turn into a whisper, no confidence. And this news certainly will be welcomed by them.
Dr. Orr in Washington, presumably the same for the Bush administration as we heard from our political correspondent Westminster, because all the same sticks have been used to beat George Bush. Where is Saddam Hussein? Where are his sons? And so on.
This is clearly a welcome development here in Washington, but I think the real key is on the ground in Iraq and how the Iraqi population responds to this. A large segment of the Iraqi population, certainly among the Sunni community in particular, has kind of been frozen in fear. And if this is an important first step of unfreezing them, that will enable the coalition to begin to pass more of the responsibilities to Iraqis.
Well, let's tackle that point, Dr. Orr, and your report that you made. I mean, how much time do you think the United States has to stabilize the situation and be seen to be improving the lives of ordinary Iraqis?
I think we've been talking about a closing window. On the security side, we have no more than, say, 3 months to really start getting the House in order, a sense of forward momentum rather than the status quo or a backward moving momentum. But more generally on the reconstruction, I think we've got about a year here to begin to make real progress in the daily lives of Iraqis. And that will only be possible if this first 3-month period can really see some progress on the security side.
Adil Darwish, do you agree broadly with that timetable?
Not really, not the 3 months. I think it's a bit optimistic on this side. I could not actually cross from Nasiriyah forward because although I was actually driving behind an American convoy, we got robbed at gunpoint.
You got robbed by just ordinary bandits?
Well, the kids. In fact, they were kids, teenage Iraqis with their guns. So it is extremely actually difficult. There's 2 points really. One is who is doing the fighting. I don't actually believe it was organized Iraqi guerrilla by Qusay and Uday. No.
So it's not Saddam Hussein at the top and still somehow orchestrating things?
Part of the resistance or the attacks is by die-hard Baathists who know if they've been captured by the Allied, be put on trial. If they've been captured by the Iraqi people, they'll be torn to pieces. So they actually want to keep it anarchy. The other part, people are extremely angry because they dislike the way the Americans actually deal with the situation, which is different from the way the British deal with it. And the third part, very importantly, either smugglers and criminal elements or foreign fighters coming from Chechnya, from Palestine, from Algeria, from as far apart as Philippines. So all of these are 3 different elements.
Robert, is part of this something which we've been reflecting over the past few months, which is that the American troops might be brilliant at winning the war and fantastic at finding Saddam Hussein's sons, but in terms of nation building, the Pentagon is absolutely the last place you would look for guidance on that?
I think this issue is a little bit overplayed. I think different countries and their different types of training and their different political profiles bring different qualities to the table, and in that I think it's good to have a diversity of different kinds of troops on the ground. At the same time, the American troops have performed extremely well in this regard. They've been stretched far beyond their training, and on the ground I observed a number of American troops, both Army and Marines, that had been organizing effective town councils, very effectively liaising with the Iraqi population. So I wouldn't take the difference too far.
Okay, but that said, Dr. Orr, how does the Bush administration internationalize this? And indeed, is that going to happen? Are they now convinced they have to do it, bring in the UN, bring in other countries?
This is an absolutely critical question. The coalition that won the war was certainly sufficient to that task, but the coalition to reconstruct Iraq is not up to the task currently. There is a need for a brand new coalition, both of major donor states. It needs money. It needs expertise from a whole range of countries. This is not something that the U.S. and the U.K. and the current coalition can do. So I think both for the practical question of troops, for the question of civilian experts, and the question of money, this coalition has to be broadened.
Adil Darwish, presumably you agree with the basic point there, and the question is how to do it, given that the UN 3 months after the war was apparently over haven't got very far.
Yes, indeed. I think the more you internationalize it, the better. And in fact, I would actually bring this good news about if indeed we can prove it was Uday and
Still
Qusay.
sceptical, are you?
Well, I'm a bit skeptical because the two being at the same place at the same time is,
Okay.
a big question mark there. But if actually proven to be them, then other reluctant players on the international scene would make certain they actually can come on board. Don't forget, in the Arab world, for example, you got the media there are very much against the governments being involved. And the more Arab and Muslim troops we see there involved in the ground there, the better it will be internationalize the whole operation.
Robert, or is it fair to say that this is not only vital that it succeeds for the population of Iraq, but it's also vital for the Bush administration and the Blair administration, who pinned everything on making this work?
Absolutely. I think in both countries the governments have staked a lot. They now need to be able to expand this coalition to share in both the challenges but also in the potential victory here. Ambassador Bremer has on his desk a sign that says victory or success has 1,000 fathers. This is the time to go find those 1,000 fathers.
Okay, thank you both very much. Now, the Prime Minister today strongly denied authorising the naming of Dr. David Kelly as the BBC source on the Iraq dossier. He was speaking to reporters on the way to Hong Kong on the latest leg of his Far East tour. An angry Mr. Blair told reporters to wait for the outcome of Lord Hutton's inquiry into Dr. Kelly's death. Meanwhile, the chairman of the BBC Board of Governors, Gavin Davis, has issued a statement saying there was no need for the governors to hold an emergency meeting in the continuing row between the BBC and the government. But it was Mr. Blair who came under most pressure, and not just from journalists. Even a group of Chinese students seemed to have it in for him.
Welcome, the British Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Blair.
If it's Tuesday, it must be China. But wherever it is, there's always the same kind of questions.
How can you get through this political crisis and regain your people's trust? Thank you.
This is a desperately sad time for the family of Dr. Kelly, and his funeral has not been held yet, and I don't want to say more about that situation, except to say that there will be, as there should be in a democracy, a proper and independent inquiry into what has happened.
Despite an eloquent no comment, by the time he'd arrived in Hong Kong, it was clear Mr. Blair had something else to say. He took time out to brief journalists en route. The Prime Minister emphatically denied authorising the leak of Dr. Kelly's name to the press. Whoever did it, those who speak out are all agreed it was not them.
I'm not aware that his name was leaked. It was certainly not leaked by me, and at all stages, certainly as far as I personally was concerned, we protected his anonymity.
If there is a spat in progress between Downing Street and the Ministry of Defence over who gets the blame for unmasking Dr. Kelly, Mr. Hoon's department is clearly losing, in the press at least. Tonight, the Ministry of Defence described those reports as misleading. For the Conservatives, Ian Duncan Smith scented blood and began talking about resignations.
If it turns out that after having granted confidentiality, Dr. Kelly's name was pushed out to the public domain for political reasons, then clearly anyone who's responsible will have to answer that charge, and one would assume their position would quite rightly be untenable.
Conventional wisdom in big political scandals is that the cover-up causes more damage than the initial scandal. In this case, it's not a cover-up, but the uncovering of the BBC source, which may well do the most damage. A short while ago, I spoke to our political correspondent, Git O'Harry, who's travelling with Mr. Blair. I began by asking him what happened on the Prime Minister's plane on the way to Hong Kong.
At last on this trip, on the 6th, the leg, actually flying from Shanghai to Hong Kong, where we are tonight, Tony Blair at last came to the back of the plane, something he usually does far more frequently on these trips, to actually talk to journalists. We think he wanted to talk about China and a meeting he had with Hong Kong students this morning, but he got cornered essentially. One journalist put it to him very bluntly, why did you authorize the naming of Dr. David Kelly? He couldn't resist it. He took the bait. He actually clearly resented the implication, and he said, that is not true. Then a whole load of us piled in and actually asked him what exactly he had authorized, or what exactly staff of his had authorized, or ministers in his cabinet had authorized. And it was at that point that he didn't deny others might be involved, but he did say, I was not involved, emphatically not. I did not authorise the naming of David Kelly.
What has the atmosphere been like on this trip? Because it's almost as if there's a parallel universe there. There's the questions that you're all asking about, and there's the events the Prime Minister is taking part in.
Gavin, it's been fascinating. We've been in this bubble, literally, the Prime Minister's plane for much of this, flying from London to Washington, from Washington to Tokyo, from Tokyo to South Korea, then different parts of China. We're now in Hong Kong. All along, we're in convoys, we're in planes, we're in secure areas, with the Prime Minister very close at hand, but rarely actually accessible to us. But we have noticed a huge change in his mood and his manner and demeanour from Tokyo on Saturday, where we saw essentially a broken man, a man who was a nervous wreck at what the fallout might be for him personally and his government from the death of Dr. Kelly, to today a man who feels he has a strategy. No, the questions have not gone away. The questions are very tough ones, and the answers will be ones that hurt. But he knows he can deal with this for the time being. He's relaxed. He feels he can bat away the most difficult questions by saying, there's an inquiry, direct your questions there. What was striking today, that's what he said about Alistair Campbell. That's what he said about Jeff Hoon. But what did he say about Tony Blair? No, don't wait for the inquiry. I'm telling you now, it wasn't me. I didn't do that.
Well, that raises a very interesting question. With that unequivocal statement from the Prime Minister and some pretty unequivocal statements here, I did all I can, I didn't leak it, and so on. I mean, somebody's head presumably is on the block.
Well, it is interesting. He says my starting point, when I asked him how he was at least going into the inquiry, my starting point, he said, is that everyone in my government acted properly. But there's a big difference between saying, as Jeff Hoon has said, as Defence Secretary tonight in a statement, that the reports about him authorising the naming, or the strategy at least, that led to the naming of Dr. Kelly were misleading. Big difference between saying misleading and saying emphatically not. And what we are seeing is Tony Blair distancing himself even from his own Defence Secretary and even from his Director of Communications, Alistair Campbell, just in case the inquiry might be able to put one or two of those men, or any others, of course, in the frame. What he's making clear is, if they are cornered, they were not acting with his blessing. They were actually essentially involved in a freelance operation, and the fire shouldn't then continue onwards and upwards until it hits him.
Gitto, thanks very much for joining us. Now, it could be the healthcare crisis that never was. The perception over the past 2 decades or more that autism was on the increase led to a desperate search for the cause. In Britain, that led to widespread fears of a link with the MMR vaccine for measles, mumps and rubella. But new research published today suggests that the huge increase in reported cases of autism since 1979 may simply be a result of more awareness, more knowledge and better record keeping. Richard Watson reports.
4-year-old Thomas Siegel suffers from seriously delayed speech. When he and his twin brother Benjamin were toddlers, their mum noticed some minor repetitive or self-stimulatory behaviour, and the boys would lead her by the hand to objects they wished to touch. They were both diagnosed on the autistic spectrum last year.
Thomas used to do sort of strange things with toys and pass them in front of his face like that. And we asked what that was, and everyone said, oh, don't worry about it again. Finally, someone just threw at us one day in the middle of the hearing test, oh, it might be autism by the way, but, we'll see you in 6 months, and that was the attitude. We then panicked and thought, it wasn't anything we'd ever considered. We never thought they were autistic, because they're quite friendly, happy little children. We just thought they weren't talking.
The cases of Benjamin and Thomas Siegel go to the heart of the current controversy surrounding the incidence of autism across the world. They don't suffer from the most severe form of the condition, but have been diagnosed as on the spectrum of the disorder. Some researchers, including those behind today's report, argue that a decade ago they may well have been categorised as developmentally delayed rather than autistic. In other words, the apparent rise in the numbers of autistic children could be a mirage. Today's report is based on medical records of 186,000 children living in north-east London. The authors say the incidence of autistic spectrum disorders rose from 1979 to 1992, but between 92 and 96, the figure levelled off to 45 to 50 new cases per year. Thomas and Benjamin are given intensive one-on-one therapy to try to fully connect them with the outside world. The researcher behind today's report argues that if there was an outside factor at play, such as the MMR jab, you would see numbers continuing to rise. But some parents of autistic children are angry about today's report alleging that it's simply a vehicle to discredit the author's former colleague who first suggested a link with MMR, but that's strongly denied.
I'm interested in the in good science, and I think our paper is good science. I mean, Andy Wakefield put up a perfectly legitimate hypothesis, and part of the scientific method is to see if you can confirm your hypotheses. We've attempted to confirm this hypothesis and haven't been able to. Ergo, it's a hypothesis which doesn't stand.
But beyond the narrow debate over MMR, there are still scientific disputes about the prevalence of autism and its possible causes. Much of the new thinking comes from the United States. Californian state researchers say that cases of the most serious or classical autism were steady during the 1970s at around 200 or 300 cases per year. But in the mid-1980s, the numbers began to climb exponentially. Today, the total number has reached more than 20,000. It's doubled in the past 4 years alone. Those with autism now account for 40% of the state's entire special needs caseload.
A portion of the rise can be attributed to a change in the way we interpret and use the criteria for diagnosing kids. But we don't believe at this point that it could be 100% attributable to that shift in the diagnostic criteria. We suspect that there could be other factors contributing to the increase, and we're putting our energy into trying to determine what that is.
The Californian state is funding a huge epidemiological study to examine whether environmental factors can be linked to autism, while Britain still debates whether there is any rise in caseload at all. Studies of genetically identical twins, where only one is autistic, proves that environmental effects can have some impact, perhaps even in the womb. And other studies show a higher prevalence of autism in children of parents who've contracted rubella, or in the 60s who used the drug thalidomide.
This is the first comprehensive examination of environmental factors in autism. We are the first group to really take on a broad range of chemicals, including medications, PBDEs, metals, pesticides, household products, chemicals that are in personal care products, to see whether any of these factors might play a role in the development of autism.
But the American research suggesting that outside factors may be at play is rejected by the author of the British study.
Well, I think the evidence is that it's got the highest genetic loading of virtually any neurodevelopmental problem, at least 80%. And I'm sure the evidence is that most of it originates and is evident from very early in gestation in the womb.
So 80%, that's not ruling out the importance of some environmental factors?
Oh, there must be some triggers which might do it, but I think these triggers are predominantly intrauterine or very early in life. And the evidence that any external force, like the MMR vaccine, for example, after the first birthday might trigger autism, there's just nothing to support it.
But many parents don't agree and point to outside factors. More cases are certainly being diagnosed. In a recent survey, 87% of local education authorities reported an increase in autism cases over the previous 5 years, putting pressure on funding. The Ziegel family had to pay for 8 months of intensive therapy on their own, around £30,000, when the London Council, Richmond, refused to pay.
Our local authority doesn't want to fund. We asked in our statement and said that's what we wanted, and they just ignored it entirely. And our only option was to go to tribunal, Special Educational Needs Tribunal, which we did at the beginning of the year. That in itself is a very stressful experience and very expensive for the parents. We did go, and it was worthwhile, and we did win full funding for 35 hours a week, which we finally got a few months later.
More and more local authorities are refusing to fund intensive therapy, and this is why reports about rising caseload are so politically hot. There are still major disagreements about the incidence of autism in Britain. Today's report suggests that 1 child in 364 is being diagnosed with autism in the North East London sample. But that's much lower than the estimate from the Medical Research Council of 1 in 167, and lower than the estimate from the National Autistic Society of 1 in 86.
Hey! No!
Today's report will offer some comfort to the government, which has been keen to back MMR. But as new thinking emerges from California, many British parents who've had their lives devastated by autism will press for far more research over here.
Richard Watson. 25 people may have gone blind or lost some of their sight as a result of NHS managers setting targets for new patients at the expense of follow-up eye appointments. That shocking revelation is in a report on government public service targets published today by a committee of MPs. They talked of targets becoming an end in themselves rather than a means of improving services. Our political correspondent David Grossman reports.
Right, James, I'll do your obs for you.
Running a few tests to keep an eye on recovery. This nurse at the Whittington Hospital in North London keeps her patients' vital signs under constant observation. The government has the same idea but goes further. It not only measures hospital performance but sets targets to encourage improvement. In fact, hospitals like this are subject to 63 binding goals and hundreds of other less important ones. After all this measurement, this hospital was awarded 2 out of 3 stars.
6-6, that's all fine.
The hospital's chief executive says targets have their place.
Pleasure.
Most staff in the health service recognise that in running a complex organisation, you have to have something that manages your performance, something that tells you how you're doing. So targets are intrinsically sensible. The difficulty that many of my colleagues have is to do with the number of targets and the difficulty in focusing on the few things that really will make a difference.
New Labour's focus on targets has come to define this government's approach not just to health, but the whole range of public services. In 1998, it set 366 in all, but what happened to them? Well, the Public Administration Select Committee today reported that only 60% had been met, and 9.8% missed completely. 5.2% were partially met, but in nearly a quarter of cases, the committee said it couldn't tell whether the targets had been met or not because either there wasn't enough data or it just wasn't reported. But the problem is that some hospitals seem to end up not really knowing whether their primary job is to make patients well or meet targets. Bristol Eye Hospital told the committee that trying to meet the target for first outpatient appointments had meant that 1,000 follow-up appointments a month were cancelled. The result, in the past 2 years, 25 patients had lost some of their vision.
There was one case of a lady who was already completely deaf and whose husband was also completely deaf, who lost virtually all her remaining vision during the time that she was waiting for a delayed follow-up appointment. So that is absolutely tragic.
Indeed, in its report, the Public Administration Committee warns of targets becoming almost an end in themselves rather than providing an accurate measure of progress towards the organisation's goals and objectives. Targets can be good servants, it says, but they are poor masters.
We've all got fixated about them. I think the media's got fixated about them, the political classes have got fixated about them. So that targets have assumed an importance they should never have assumed. And I think we say, take a step back, take a deep breath, let's see what's valuable about them, and let's seek to minimise the perverse consequences.
Like a dieter who's discovered that simply jumping on the scales every 5 minutes doesn't help you lose weight, so the government seems to have come to the realisation that simply setting loads of targets doesn't, in and of itself, improve public services. In a speech earlier this month, Tony Blair hinted at a new approach, saying that in the past they'd perhaps come across as a bit too technocratic and managerial. But given that setting targets has been up to now the key mechanism which the government's used to help ensure the billions being poured into schools and hospitals aren't wasted, is this government really ready to fundamentally change its culture? The committee concluded that behind the government's words about less Whitehall control of public services, there is as yet no action. Other observers say we need to change the way that public servants think.
Beyond merely talking about targets, there was a fundamental cultural problem, which is that there was a gross imbalance between the rewards, by which I don't mean financial, for success and the penalties, sometimes daunting, for failure. And this tends to mean that people focus much more on process than they do on outcome. It means that they are not innovatory, they're not constantly willing to try out new things. There's one thing the public sector needs to learn, is that the man who makes no mistakes makes nothing.
At the Whittington Hospital, the chief executive is doing his own diagnostic checks.
How are we for medical and surgical admissions?
He, like the Public Administration Committee, believes that the key to changing the public service culture is not abandoning targets, but devolving them.
I'd like to see targets which are increasingly designed locally, which are owned by local clinicians working in hospitals such as this. Because only if you do that do you get doctors and nurses and others who feel that they need to deliver them and they understand the reasons for doing so. If too many detailed targets come from outside, come from the Department of Health, it can be quite difficult persuading people that that's the essence of their care for patients.
Back in 1998, a far less careworn-looking Tony Blair, supported by a few friends he seems to have lost along the way, launched the government's annual report, designed to be an authoritative measure of how far it was meeting its targets. The idea was quietly dropped in 2001. The Public Administration Committee says it should be resurrected.
We like the fact that when the government came in 1997, it started producing an annual report. I think we were about to say things about it in terms of our committee. We were about to say we'd like it to be externally validated so people knew the figures stood up. It was taking a lot of flack for it simply being a glossy brochure. We'd like to return to that, learn the lessons from it, so that we get an annual performance report from government, so we can see how much of our money they're spending and what we're getting for it.
Like the drugs on this trolley, it seems when it comes to targets, it's the dose that determines whether they cure or make matters worse. The next cycle of target setting is due to begin soon. The Public Administration Committee says that before then, the government needs to set a strategy for reducing the number of targets and devolving them to the people who have to provide the services.
David Grossman, I'm joined now by the Health Minister, Dr. Stephen Lederman. Dr. Lederman, do you agree it's absolutely shocking, the idea that government targets could end up with 25 people having their sight impaired or losing their eyesight altogether?
If that was the case, it would certainly be a very disappointing outcome for those targets.
But they say that was the case. That's what the hospital says.
Well, they said that they identified 25 people who lost some lines of vision whilst they're waiting for their follow-up appointment. Whether that was due to the targets or not, we don't know.
But they say the target was to get people in for the first appointment.
If you let me finish, I will explain. We would only know whether that was as a result of the targets if they'd also told us how many people would have lost lines of vision before the targets were set, and if they'd also told us how many people have gained sight or had their sight problems fixed as a result of meeting the government's targets. Since we don't have those two facts, we can't judge the relevance of that particular piece of information.
Hold on a second.
But I do accept the principle, however, that if targets are skewing clinical priorities, that would be wrong, which is why we've always said that the first priority is clinical judgment, and that clinical judgment must come first.
So they can say get lost to the targets, they can stuff the targets.
It is the responsibility of the clinicians to follow their clinical judgment. We've always made that absolutely clear.
And if they say stuff the targets, they won't lose money?
They won't lose money if they work with their local management to find ways of implementing their clinical judgment in a way that also maintains the priorities that the government is trying to set.
That is very interesting, because you just heard James Strachan from the Audit Commission there saying there is a gross imbalance between the rewards, and I don't just mean the financial rewards for success, and the penalties sometimes daunting of failure.
I think James is a little mixed himself, because if you read the report of the Audit Commission, it does actually say many flattering things about targets and explains why targets are necessary. Indeed, the Public Administration Select Committee report that you're commentating on here is actually very flattering about targets, and it points out that targets can be beneficial, and it in fact congratulates the government on being prepared to set them.
It's flattering in saying that some targets are necessary, but it's not flattering about suggesting that you should follow them like the Albanian Communist Party in the 1950s and do everything that the targets say.
I couldn't agree more, which is why we don't tell people to do that. We have said all along that clinical judgment must come first. The correct response, if a clinician believes that he or she is being asked to distort his clinical judgment because of these priorities, is to go to their local management and stress that they need to see patients in a particular order and work out with management the way that they can achieve their clinical priorities at the same time
no
as
hospital
management can
will lose its 3 stars, no hospital will lose its money if they go and do that.
I don't accept that hospitals will lose stars if they are properly managed, working towards
So they're all neurotic about nothing. All these staff, all these healthcare professionals worried about targets, they're just being neurotic, are they? Because it doesn't matter, actually.
I don't believe all these clinical professionals are getting neurotic about these targets. As the chief executive of the Whittington said, you do need targets in order to manage an organisation effectively.
Sure.
That's what he's got.
I think everybody agrees that, and the Public Administration Committee agrees. But what they say is, you've got to set a target for how many targets you should have. You should refine them and decide what ones you should have.
Which exactly is what we've been doing over the last few
years. You're going to get rid of some.
We have been getting rid of some of them. We've been improving some of them. One of the recommendations today is they should be independently monitored. We're already moving to that in the health arena, for example. We've just legislated to create an organisation called the Clinical Health Audit and Inspection Service, which is going to look at to independently monitor these targets. We'll refine these targets as we go along. I think it's a very interesting suggestion they've come up with, that they should be more localised. The National Health Service is already looking at that as a possibility. So yes, I think we're on board with many of their recommendations.
I just want to be clear about this, because this goes way beyond your department into education, where teachers are fed up with this as well, is if a professional, healthcare professional says, sorry, this target set by government is silly, it doesn't do the best for my patients, nobody will be penalised, no money will be lost.
If their clinical judgment is being perversely affected by the targets, then they are told that their first priority is to their clinical judgment. They should raise that with their management, and they should try and work through with their management the way that both their clinical judgment and the priorities, not the government priorities after all, but the people's priorities, because we set these targets according to what people tell us are important. They tell us waiting times are important, so we want waiting times reflected in these targets. They should work together with their local management teams to find ways to implement the targets in a sensible and constructive fashion that delivers both.
Right, thanks very much. Newspapers in a moment, but before that, a roundup of today's main news. And our top story tonight, the Foreign Secretary has welcomed the news of the death of the two sons of Saddam Hussein in a US military raid in northern Iraq. Mr. Strauss said the killing of Uday and Qusay Hussein gave reassurance to the Iraqi people. The head of British Airways, Rod Eddington, has apologised for the long delays experienced by passengers at Heathrow Airport. The airline says it's been clearing a backlog of flights caused by an unofficial strike by check-in staff last Friday and Saturday. Talks to end the dispute about a new clocking-in system are continuing. Rebels in Liberia say they've called a ceasefire in their battle with government forces, but they've reportedly refused to sign a peacekeeping agreement drafted by mediators from other West African countries. Up to 700 people are thought to have been killed in fierce fighting in the capital, Monrovia, in the past few days. Around a dozen people, including 4 police officers and a British tourist, have been injured in 2 bomb blasts in Spain. 2 hotels were targeted in the popular holiday resorts of Benidorm and Alicante. The Basque separatist group ETA has been blamed. The Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, has announced that the British terror suspects held by the US at Guantanamo Bay will not face the death penalty. Lord Goldsmith had travelled to Washington to meet with Pentagon officials to ensure that the 9 British people being held get a fair trial.
Made very significant progress on a number of important issues, including the death penalty. It's been confirmed that the United States prosecutor will not seek the death penalty in relation to either of the 2 British nationals currently the subject of potential proceedings.
And Tony Blair wasn't the only one put under pressure by the students in China, as we saw earlier. They made his wife, Cherie, sing a song.
When I get older, losing my head, many years from now.
Well, after her husband refused to take part, she managed a swift rendition of the Beatles classic, When I'm 64. Could she have had the Prime Minister's retirement in her thoughts, it says here. And the markets, the FTSE 100 share index closed up, as did the Dow Jones in New York. Against the euro, the pound fell. Against the dollar, the pound also fell. I don't know when the album's coming out, but there we are. And let's have a quick look at tomorrow morning's front pages. The Guardian has Dead, the Sons of Saddam, with a picture of the 2 on the front. And also BBC to produce Kelly tape in bid to exonerate reporter. The BBC has a tape of Susan Watt talking to Dr. Kelly, it says. The Sun has got him. Tyrant's evil sons killed in 3-hour shootout. And the Telegraph, Saddam's sons killed in raid. That's all from Newsnight tonight, but there's round-the-clock news coverage on BBC News 24, which you can find, of course, on cable, satellite and Freeview. I'm back with more tomorrow. Till then, from all of us on the programme, good night.